Hello, I'm Luca Coasters, and today I'm continuing the series in which I review my top 20 coasters, and this review is of my 8th favourite coaster, El Toro at Six Flags Great Adventure. I actually have a bit of history with this coaster. I first went to Six Flags Great Adventure in April 2018 as a part of a family trip to New York, and naturally I was most excited for El Toro, so it was one of the first attractions that I headed to, and when I got there, it was closed, and it remained so for the rest of the day. So for over a year I was itching to get on El Toro. Unfortunately, I was able to secure 7 rides in it during my most recent visit to Six Flags Great Adventure as a part of my 2019 US summer road trip, and this ride did not disappoint. El Toro is one of only 4 Intamin prefabricated wooden coasters built, with the others being Colossus at Heidi Park, Balder at Liseberg, and T-Express at Everland. But despite their popularity among park goers, they came with a hefty price tag and require specialist maintenance which other woodies don't. Out of the 4 Intamin prefabs built, El Toro was the largest, measuring a height of 181 feet or 55.2 meters and reaching a speed of up to 70 miles per hour or 112.7 kilometers per hour. Upon opening, El Toro broke the record for the steepest drop on a wooden roller coaster, and when Son of Beast at Kings Island closed in 2009, El Toro also claimed the record for the tallest and fastest wooden roller coaster. However, since then, El Toro's records have been taken by the RMC Top Track wooden coasters. The reason that Intamin prefabs stand out among other wooden coasters is because of the fact that the track is completely fabricated in a factory before the coaster is assembled on site. This allows the manufacturing of the track to be more precise, making the track more robust and smoother, and this allows for much stronger forces to be exerted than you'd see on a normal wooden coaster, allowing prefabs to have strong positive and negative forces, which are very prevalent on El Toro. Due to the scale of this coaster, El Toro has a very intimidating presence at Six Flags Great Adventure, despite it being located next to the world's tallest coaster, King Dakar. The ride makes a thundering roar as it navigates a layout, and what is great about the queue for the ride is that it's directly next to the largest hills, which helps build up the anticipation. Unfortunately, you must put all of your loose articles in a locker before entering the queue line, so you can't take photos from these amazing angles that you can get in the queue line. The line itself lacks theming, but the general area looks pretty nice with some decent looking buildings. It's great for Six Flags, but it's lackluster compared to the European parks that I'm used to. The station also looks great, but it was actually reused from Viper, the previous Togo looping coaster on that spot. The inside of the station is usually really crowded, but you can choose your row. The most crowded area of the station is near the front of the train, but the further back you get, the quieter it gets. So while the wait for the front was over a 5 train wait, the back few rows were a 1 or 2 train wait. Unfortunately, when I visited, the dispatch times on El Toro were abysmal. Not because of the ride-ops, but actually because of the park guests. Most of them were really slow and tried to take loose articles on the ride, but because of the strict no loose articles policy on the ride, they ended up taking ages. Also, it felt like every ride, there was at least one rider who was too large, which further slowed down operations. Despite this, the trains themselves aren't too bad. They consist of 6 cars, of which each has 3 rows. The seats aren't too padded, but they're quite roomy and the restraints are fairly comfortable. They're similar to the T-bars featured on other Intamin coasters. However, on El Toro, the bars are held on either side of the restraint instead of the middle. Once a train dispatches, it navigates a 180-degree left-hand turn, which leads to some drive ties which feed the train into the cable lift. This lift is really fast for a woody, but towards the top it slows down considerably, so you aren't going too fast into the pre-drop section. During this 180-degree left-hand turn, the train picks up some speed, leading into the immense 176-foot drop. This 76-degree drops actually begins while the train is still turning. You also receive some great airtime in this drop, which starts off as floater, but over a couple of seconds builds up into strong ejector. You are launched out of your seat by the end of this airtime moment. However, I was disappointed with how long it took to build up to the ejector, making this moment feel less aggressive. Nonetheless, this doesn't take away from the incredibly strong airtime, which is so impressive. The strength feels similar to the first drop on Wildfire, but the transition into the airtime on El Toro is much more drawn out, making it feel less insane. But for around a second you are being launched out of your seat in a moment of airtime which pins you against your restraint, before being slammed back into your seat in a surprisingly strong moment of positives. El Toro pulls around 4.4 G in this valley, which is a bizarrely high figure for a wooden coaster, which usually don't exceed 3.5 Gs. At this point you can really feel the force, which helps maintain a fast pace. However, it does cause another problem, which is roughness. While the coaster actually tracks well, it still has the signature wooden coaster rumble, which is intensified by the abnormally strong positives. For some this may increase the intensity, but for me it made the coaster more uncomfortable and harder to marathon. During this valley, the train dives through some of the structure of a later element in this ride, making for a great head chopper, which felt like it got so close to the train, so much so that I actually put my hands down because of it. The train then flies out of the structure and begins the ascent into the first massive 112-foot Airtime Hill. Compared to the maximum height of this coaster, this first hill is tiny, meaning that the train absolutely hauls over this hill. Despite the short height of this hill, the entrance and exit are pretty steep, and this means that despite there being some really strong airtime, like on the drop, it takes a while to build up to the ejector. Well, in the front row you actually do get a sudden jolt of ejector, but it isn't too sustained, and in the back you start off experiencing floater, which takes a second to build up into the amazing ejector. So you start off just floating out of your seat, but you end up being forced against your restraint during the descent. However, this does take away from the aggressiveness of this coaster, so it makes a strong airtime less exciting. You were then crushed into your seat in a strong moment of positives in this next valley. While it isn't the most comfortable, the strong forces are impressive. What I also love is that for the first few elements of this coaster, you have a constant progression of strong forces, and while the transition between the strong forces are quite drawn out, the sheer strength of them alone is insane. The train then rises up into the next hill. This 100-foot hill feels very similar to the previous hill, with the airtime only feeling slightly stronger, but also slightly less sustained, but it isn't too noticeable. I still have the same problems with this hill as I do the previous hill, but I still love the strong air which lasts for so long. The following valley has good positives, but they don't match those on the last two valleys. However, it still maintains the amazing pace of the first few elements. The train then rises up a shallow incline and banks to the right, while also giving a brief moment of floater. The train then begins a turning descent, which starts off giving weak positives which end up building into fairly strong positives, which are also really sustained. Some people say this turn is rough and that it jackhammers, but I didn't find it to be too bad, and it is no worse than the valleys prior, and I say that this turn is even slightly smoother and more comfortable than them. The train then makes a shallow ascent while slightly turning to the left, giving no amazing forces, and in this element the train does slow down noticeably. That then leads into a fairly large drop, but as it is so shallow this drop only delivers floater, which is decent, but it doesn't match the ejector of the first half and it kind of kills the pacing. At the bottom of the drop, the ride flies through some more wooden structure, which gives a nice head chopper, but that is the only outstanding thing about this valley, as the positives in this section are also weak. The train then flies through a drawn out, low to the ground speed hill, and the forces alone on the speed hill are nothing special, it's just again decent floater, but seeing as it's not sustained it isn't too enjoyable. However, what I love about this element is the sensation of speed, as you're flying so low to the ground, which is added to by the signature wooden coaster rumble. I feel like that rumble, while it takes away from the first section of the ride with high positives because of the discomfort, it actually adds to the middle section of the ride as it helps to heighten the sensation of speed, which makes up for the lacking forces, meaning that the pacing isn't harmed too much. On the second half of the speed hill, the train once again enters a wooden structure, which helps to further improve the sensation of speed as you fly through it. While in the structure, the train flies up into a step up, which has a very brief and honestly hardly noticeable moment of floater. After that, the train suddenly banks to the left and then slams you with positives in a tight left-hand turn. During this turn, you also receive the best head chopper of the ride, a random piece of wooden structure which doesn't actually seem to support anything, and it actually feels like you can almost hit this piece of wood, adding to the thrill of this already intense turn. The train then rises up into a hill which is legendary among coaster enthusiasts, the Rolling Thunder Hill. The hill received its name from the fact that it was situated over some of the track from a now removed racing wooden coaster, Rolling Thunder. Many people say that this element has the strongest airtime on any coaster, and there was even a rumour that it reached -2G in the back, which is just absurd. Unfortunately, that is not true, and in actuality, this moment at best is only just stronger than the airtime experienced on the drop, and it isn't even too much stronger than the massive sustained hills prior. This hill actually pulls closer to -1.3G, and it would maybe hit -1.4 if it's running really well, which is still far off the unrealistic -2G rumour, and even then, this element is very temperamental. As the element comes so late in the layout, combined with the fact that it's so tall with such a sharp crest, it can deliver much weaker airtime, especially in colder weather and earlier in the day. But when I first rode El Toro, it was already the afternoon, so it had sped up and was hauling by the time I rode it. The airtime, while being slightly stronger than the prior moments of ejector, is because of the shaping of this element. In the front you receive a sharp and brief jolt of ejector when entering the hill, and in the back you only get ejector once the train has crested the hill, and you're only receiving this ejector for under a second. One thing that is nice though, is that the transition into the strong negative forces is fairly sudden, making the element feel more aggressive than the previous hills. It isn't too abrupt, as you can still feel it build up from the floater, but it doesn't take nearly as long as the two previous ejector hills. The aggressiveness of this hill could have helped fuel the -2G rumour, but still, this element doesn't feel nearly as strong as a couple other airtime moments I've experienced. Nonetheless, you are still violently thrown up out of your seat and pinned against your restraint, and it just feels like the train is being folded over the hill as the bulky trains navigate this tight element, but the airtime might not be as strong as most people would expect. You are then suddenly slammed back into your seat in another great moment of positives while the train banks to the left. And while these high Gs aren't the most sustained, the abruptness of them makes it so much fun. The train then swiftly banks to the right and navigates a right hand turn which delivers crushing positives which ram you into a seat for around a second. The train then banks to the left and goes for another tight left hand turn, before navigating a longer right hand turn which has more sustained positives. At the end of this right hand turn, the train rises slightly as it enters a small twisted hill. This hill has strong floater, but it isn't too memorable, as you only experience the airtime for a short duration of time while the train twists from right to left. Then the train enters a short left hand turn before going into an even weaker twisted hill, which barely even gives it airtime, and that then leads into a shallow hill into the brakes. So overall, this ride is amazing. While it isn't the most aggressive, the sheer forces make up for that. In terms of wooden coasters, El Toro has some of the most impressive forces, but while the forces were strong, they didn't flow well into each other for me. I prefer more abrupt and violent moments of airtime, whereas El Toro is slightly more graceful, taking its time to transition from the strong positives to the strong negatives. One thing I also noticed is the lack of laterals, which is surprising seeing as it is a wooden coaster, which is also part of the reason that this ride feels less aggressive, as you're only being thrown around on one axis. The ride also has some so-called dead spots, most significantly the return trip of the outer back section and the final few elements of the coaster don't really deliver, with them mostly having only floater airtime. However, in the parts of this coaster where the elements deliver, they really deliver, especially if you just love raw, strong forces. For me, I prefer a combination of loads of forces, all in quick succession in every direction, which El Toro doesn't really give, which is what separates it from every ride above it in my rankings. But I can still appreciate the amazing forces, and I can definitely understand why many say that I underrate this coaster, as it isn't really my type of ride. But I still had a blast riding El Toro loads during my time at Six Flags Great Adventure, despite the slight discomfort it causes. But I can overlook that and see this coaster for the amazing experience it gives, so overall I'd give it a score of 95 out of 100. So, comment down below your thoughts on this amazing Intamin prefabricated wooden coaster, and if you enjoyed this video and want to see more content like it, then make sure you like and subscribe.